Now we're in business. Now let me go back to the presentation. Thanks again for being patient, folks. All right, so ah, what is going on here? Okay, so the whole purpose of the timelines in real estate contracts, prevent deals from failure and legal issues. As a broker, I see a lot of different situations and scenarios that happen in a real estate transaction. I see the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, it doesn't really matter in who you represent. If you're representing the buyer, fantastic. If you're representing the seller, fantastic. The whole common ground of what we do is to get to the finish line, right? To close the deal, officially record, hand the keys over to the buyer, and the seller now moves on to their next chapter, right? Well, during the process, right? During the process, you may have obstacles, hurdles, and challenges, right? It's your responsibility at the end of the day, folks, is to understand how timeline works, right? In certain circumstances, that if there is a wall that you hit, how do you pivot out of that to ultimately get to the finish line, right? Now, most deals will have your hurdles and your challenges, but we still press forward, right? And we close it. Stressful, sometimes a little overwhelming, the anxiety of what we do, right? But then there's some that definitely fall apart, right? The deal gets canceled. Okay. So we'll dive into the conversation and kind of get a better sense in how all this works. So overview of the RPA. Okay. Why is this little thing right in the smack in the middle? Maybe if I move it to the side. All right, key components to understand. Offer terms, contingencies, timelines, cancellation clause. So part of the beautiful thing about what we do is this form called RPA, Residential Purchase Agreement, right? In essence, that's what you need in order for you to submit a offer, right? Price, terms, and conditions. Part of that process is, when you're in the beginning showing properties and your client identifies a property that they really truly want, they ask you to submit an offer, right? Yeah, we want this place. Let's go ahead and submit an offer. Now, part of it is the price, right? That's going to be always the number one. How many days has the property been on the market, right? If the property is hot on the press, right? It's only been there for 3 days, right? Well, you may have other buyers that may be interested in the property because it's a freshly new listing, right? Now to a property that's been on the market for 50 days, right? Well, a little stale, it's been there. It's questionable. Why has this property not sold, right? It may be overpriced. It may be the location. Maybe it's the condition of the property, right? All of those variables will dictate why properties stay on the market and why other properties sell immediately or within a time frame, right? Contingencies are also part of the factors, right? Contingencies, in my opinion, are like walls. Every time a buyer releases a contingency, right? One, buyer is moving forward per the contract, but more so, it's also exposing that risk. Okay. Because there's risk. Now, let's say that all of you, okay, are sellers. You're all sellers. Would you take on an offer that a buyer does not put a commitment of some type? And that commitment is usually earnest deposit, okay? In good faith, a earnest deposit. I am not going to go into escrow for 30 days when the buyer doesn't have any skin in the game, okay? This is why I'll consider your offer, but I'm also looking at the conditions and the terms. What are you proposing? Are you giving me what I want or you're not giving me what I want, right? The beauty and the dynamics is counteroffers. Okay, you have counteroffers as well. Now, all of the heavy lifting, ladies and gentlemen, has to start from the very beginning, okay? Because that's where the buyer, still wants to get into the property, right? Get their offer accepted, go into escrow, and ultimately successfully close the deal. But in essence, you have, as a seller and as a listing agent, you have a little bit more leverage in the beginning, because if you have one offer or you have five offer, now you still have that leverage because someone is obviously interested in your listing, right? So now it's what we call the tennis, back and forth, right? Now there's negotiations in the very beginning, there's negotiations during, and guess what? There's saying maybe some negotiations at the very end of the deal to make this deal stick and ultimately close and record, right? That's where the contingencies come into play. Now, why is contingencies important in a real estate process? Because again, it goes back to the commitment that the buyer has. I'm going to take someone serious if they're pushing to release contingencies. If a buyer is not going to release contingencies, then it puts a position is, are they serious? Are they playing games? What's the reason behind them not releasing conditions? Okay. And it could be many variables. Maybe the agent that represents the buyer is not sophisticated enough to understand the ins and outs and the importance. There's rules and regulations to everything, right? When you go on the freeway, the speeding limit is $65. Does everyone stick to that 65? Probably not. Okay, there's a little bit of bending here and there. I get it. But then you have drivers that go below 65. It's like we're not in the 80s anymore going 55 miles an hour, but they still do, right? But you have options, right? And those options that you have is you got lane 1, lane 2, lane 3, lane 4, right? You don't have to stay in one specific lane. Well, those contracts also work that way as well. Okay. Everything is subject to change as long as the buyer and the seller come to an agreement. That's it. It's the direction of the buyer, it's the direction of the seller. We're just navigating on what they want to do because at the end, they're the ones buying, they're the ones selling. Those are why we have timelines as well. I'm not going to go into escrow and hope that in a year from now we close, right? As it is, it's already hard enough to close these darn deals in 30 days or less. But there's timelines that we have to understand and follow. Follow the rules. Remember when you were in school? Okay, your teacher would tell you you had to do X, Y, and Z, right? And if you didn't follow the rules, what would happen? I know what would happen to me. I grew up in the 70s and 80s. The principal had a wooden bat that they could smack you. Okay. Not that we're going to do that in real estate. But in all essence, right? What's that, Steve? Exactly. So this is why it's important to understand not just the offered terms, contingencies, but also timelines, right? But then if this does go sideways, then there's that opportunity to cancel too. And that's okay as well, as long as it's done within the contractual position, right? As long as the buyer follows the rules and decides to back out, then there is no risk involved when it comes to their deposit. Okay. So those are some of the components that you have to understand and be able to navigate. This is why you're the professional going through this. The RPA is the backbone of real estate transaction. Okay, everything that we do is that RPA. That's what starts and that what kills the deal. Okay, we have to understand the ins and outs of it. Make sense? Okay. So understanding contingencies, the definition, conditions that must be met for a contract to become binding, right? If I submit an offer to you and you review it with your client, the seller, is that a binding agreement? I just showed you as the seller, here's the offer. Is that a binding agreement? Yes or no? No, it's not, right? One, the seller acknowledges, the listing agent acknowledges, but there is no confirmation. There is no signatures, right? So it's not considered a binding agreement. It only becomes a binding agreement until there's mutual between the buyer who submitted the offer, right? And the seller who acknowledges the offer, right? But they have to also initial and signature on it as well. What if I submit an offer and I'm missing, as a buyer, I'm missing a couple initials, but the seller signs all of the purchase agreement, the initials and signature? Is that a binding agreement? No, it's not, right? Because there's not a meeting of the mind still. In the eyes of the buyer may think that it's an agreement, but if you really dissect it, you really don't have a binding agreement. The binding agreement is only once it's all signed and executed. Okay, that's when it starts. The purpose: protect both buyer and seller by outlining the specifics of the condition, right? This is why it's vital, crucial. It is your duty to look at the offer that comes in and make sure that you see every element of that offer. What I do is usually, and I don't have one, the offer and I'll there's none. And then I'll start highlighting everything because I don't want to miss anything. Because if I have to do a counter offer, I need to know exactly what I'm going to be countering, because there may be a little thing that I miss can jeopardize this, and now it may impact the seller's position, right? Just like a deposit. Can a buyer put any specific deposit amount? If I make an offer for $1 million and I put $1 deposit, is that okay? Why do you think it's not okay?
Not enough.
Okay, all right, it's not enough. Anyone else? If the listing agent, interesting. Why would you think the listing agent? So if the listing agent says to you, well, this is an offer, it's a great solid offer, it's $1 million, it's where we need to be. We go through elements, but they're only putting in $1, but it's okay. I think we should accept it. All right.
I think that the that would be where the $1, because it doesn't show that much commitment from the buyer.
Okay. All right. Good point, right? But what if the seller is okay with that $1 deposit? I've seen deals happen with $500 in escrow. $500 in escrow, and the seller accepts. Now, I don't know if they knew what they were signing. I don't know. I was not part of it. I just saw the offer. And I was like, wow, that's pretty interesting, right? Pretty interesting that the seller would take 500. Now, it could be many scenarios, right? Maybe this is the only offer, and this is the only offer they've had for a very long time, if not the only offer, right? And they don't want to lose this particular buyer. But I've seen offers with very, very small amounts of deposit. Okay. This is why you want to look at everything to see what the price, what are the terms, right? Are they asking for a short escrow or a long escrow? Are they willing to give something, right? Maybe seller in possession after close of escrow, right? Maybe their down payment is very large, right? More than 20%. Maybe it's 50%. Maybe it's a cash deal, right? This is why it's important for you as an agent to look at everything so you know exactly how to approach the conversation with the seller, right? Absolutely. Steve, you had a question, sir?
expression, the art of the deal. Okay. You know, it all really falls into what kind of a marketplace is the market in, is the seller in at the moment you're representing the seller. Okay. Is it a buyer's market where, as Simon alluded to, now the market for 4 months or longer, not a single offer, and are you willing to, and yet when you do due diligence as the listing agent, his buyer is well pre-approved, money's in the bank, looking for a short escrow, and stream of $1. Yes, if the seller is okay with it, by the way, that is the minimum amount of offer consideration, which makes it a legally accepted offer.
Yeah.
So yes. On the other hand, if you have multiple offers, it's a seller's market. Okay. Now wants to come in with a ridiculously low amount. You know, the qualification on the borderline of being a strong buyer. Why in the world would you want to subject your seller to the potential of if this buyer were to back up? Whoever he said, market. So it's understanding part of the agent's step is understanding when it's advisable to be able to advise your client to flex a little bit more than others based on the marketplace.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Yeah,
So.
good point. Good point.
If,
Speak up louder too, so people on Zoom can hear you too.
So in the case.
You gotta be
that-
like Steve's voice.
In the case, in the case that it is a seller's market. Seller to reply to the buyer. To say, yes, I accept your deposit or not.
Yeah, that's a good point. So remember, the contract has a timeline, what we call an expiration date. After you submit an offer, you have 72 hours, 3 days after you submit, to acknowledge that the seller has received it and ultimately makes a decision to either accept, counter, or reject the offer. Now, if they don't respond within the 72 hours, what happens is now your offer becomes an expired offer. So either they revive it by an addendum or counter offers, or you have to submit another offer, to start the timeline. Okay. But usually you have 3 days, 3 days to do so.
Simon, we actually didn't hear what they were saying. So can you just give us a quick summary for those on Zoom?
Yeah, so thank you. So one of the questions was, how long does the seller have to respond to an offer? And the time frame is 72 hours from the time of acceptance, or excuse me, at the time of actual submission of a offer. The seller has 72 hours to either accept, counter, or reject. If they don't do any of the above, then the offer becomes an expired offer, and therefore the only way to revive it is if the seller decides and a counteroffer, and or the buyer would have to submit a new offer. Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Actually, it actually, the seller can actually be stalled. For an expiration date.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, without being written. In legal terms, if the seller were to accept an offer without an expiration date, then the offer becomes what is known as the voidable. It can be void by the maker of the offer, encouraged by the buyer, saying, I don't accept your acceptance. Accept it by deadline. And it really doesn't, whether it be voidable or not, if there's going to be a counter offer. Because a counter offer by definition buying and selling switches happen when they, you know, you offer, they, a offer can accept it.
Yeah, but also keep this in mind. It depends on who you're working with. You know, because there's some agents there that are very particular. And if once that offer gets expired, they say, nope, you're gonna have to submit another offer, you know? So it really depends on who you're working with, Steve, right? Because at the end, you and I understand those elements, and I'm very flexible because I understand the components. Sometimes sellers just don't have the time and it does end up expiring. I get it. So I can be lenient just because I know the ins and outs. Steve, being in the industry for a very long time, understands and can be lenient as well. But then you have these other agents that are by the book, right? And those are the ones that will say, look, you know what, the offer expires, so the only way we'll consider is, you know, submitting a new offer. And I've seen those situations as well too. So just keep that in mind. Hopefully that was clear on the people from Zoom as well. So let's go into the common contingencies. So inspection is 17 days, allows property inspections. What does that mean? So from the time of acceptance, right? That's when the time clock begins, right? So 17 calendar days, not business days, calendar days, the buyer has the right to do any type of inspections regarding the property. Okay, if that's a home inspection, if that's roof inspection, electrical, sewer inspection, any and all inspections. They can do all of them. If they want to do 50 different inspections, God bless them, let them do it. Okay. You cannot deny, not you, but the seller cannot deny because the contract is very clear and concise of what that means. You must allow that to happen. Because if you don't, and then the buyer buys the property, and now something comes up, and they say, well, they cut my time frame from 17 days. They only said I can only do additional inspections. Anything after 5 inspections, they're not allowing me to do. That can come back to haunt the seller. Okay. So be flexible and educate your sellers in how all that works, because this can happen where a liability can occur. Appraisals ensure property value, right? That's part of the process. The beautiful thing is there is protection for the buyer too. Who in the right mind wants to buy a property that's over evaluated, right? You submit an offer for $1 million, but it comes back only 800,000, right? Who's going to want to pay more for a property that is not worth the value, right? Well, again, depends. Because I've seen situations and scenarios where the seller does sell the property to a buyer that does not appraise because the buyer truly wants the property. And it could be supply and demand. You know, it's a very unique, very special property. And someone has a pulse that they really truly want this property and they're willing to do whatever it takes, even pay more than what it's worth. Again, it really depends on the buyer. If the buyer and the seller are okay with it, then God bless them. Do whatever you want. Okay. That's the dynamics of these agreements, right? It's not our job to dictate what they should be doing, right? It's then to tell us what we should be doing in order to get to the finish line. But this is why they have an appraisal, for that protection in case it doesn't appraise, right? Because that's now a new negotiations, right? But if you don't have your appraisal contingency and you removed it from the very beginning, and now you're asking for a price reduction, does the seller need to give you that reduction? The answer is no, because you released that appraisal contingency from the very beginning. So be very careful, especially when there's multiple offers, right? Maybe part of the condition is they're asking for the buyer to release the appraisal contingency. That's a risk. And if the buyer is willing to take the risk, then the buyer would have to come in with the difference if it doesn't appraise. But also on the purchase agreement, there's a section that if the buyer is okay to a certain extent. It's like the rubber band, right? I'm only willing to go as far, but then after that, I'm not going to risk it, right? And on the purchase agreement, it allows you to put a stipulation in there that says that the buyer is willing to pay in the difference if it evaluates at this price. So let's just say as a scenario, you submit an offer for $1 million, right? But the buyer is okay if the property does not appraise at $1 million, but is willing to still consider and take that offer if it appraises at 950. Okay, 950. So that means that the buyer will still put in the difference of $50,000 to make this deal work. Anything less than 950, the buyer can either try to negotiate with the seller, if the seller is willing to bend a little bit, or ultimately has the right to exercise and cancel because they still have their contingency in place. Make sense? Okay. Loan as well, too. Loan. Back in the days, loan was 17 days as well. Now it's 21 days, right? Yeah. Is it 21 days or 17? 17 days, right? Yeah, I have my backwards. It used to be 21 days. Yeah, it used to be 21 days where you had the ability to release loan contingencies. Now the loan contingency is within 17 days. So this is again where you have to be very proactive. If you're working with the buyer, make sure you're in communications with the lender, right? Ask them, look, are we going to be able to close this deal in 30 days or less? Ask them, part of the loan contingency is 17 days. Can you make it happen? If they're uncertain, okay, be mindful about that because that can kill the deal and ultimately jeopardize the transaction and jeopardize the buyer's deposit. So communications with the lender and make sure if you do need that additional time, right? What do you need to do? You need to ask for that extension of time to release loan contingency or even appraisal, because sometimes it may take more time than 17 days because they were not on top of it. Remember, your job is to protect the buyer's best interest, right? Just as much as the seller's best interest. So depending on who you represent is your common goal. And if you don't, then you're going to see a potential liability. Sale a buyer's property. Buyer must sell home first, right? If there is a condition that they have to sell their home before they can buy this home, remember, that's like a chain transaction, right? Multiple transactions. That can be a headache in itself. I don't recommend it, but agents still do it, and then they're stressed out. I would wait, to get to a certain time frame if you're representing the buyer who is you're representing them as a seller, right? Before you start shopping around and looking for other properties. Wait until you sell this property and at least that the buyer has ultimately released uh any and all contingencies because you still have 2 weeks, right? From the time of the buyer to release all contingencies to close the deal. I would say start the shopping and ultimately try to navigate it. Don't do it too early, and now you're in a situation where you open escrow on your seller who is a buyer, and now that buyer that's buying your client's property falls out, and now you're in a crunch time on the up leg property. It can be very stressful. Okay, but I'll leave it up to the agent to navigate that. It's best to wait until this property is close to closing and then start shopping around for another. You can always ask for an extension to say after close of escrow, do a rent back, or heck, just move. Sell it, have the proceeds, and now you're at least at ease, right? Well, the problem is all of the furniture. Well, there's storage. There's a lot of things you can do, right? But a lot of agents know how to maneuver and navigate that when you have multiple transactions. But again, remember, what if that buyer is also selling their property, right? And you're involved in that transaction and you're representing the seller now as a buyer and they're buying the property, but the seller is also buying another property, right? And they're being pressured. and then they're putting pressure on us, and then we're putting pressure on the buyer, and then let's say that that buyer is now putting pressure on that buyer that's buying their property. See where I'm going with this? Okay, I don't need that extra headache, but if you want it, hey, go for it. Go for it.
Years ago, we were talking about-
Really? Wow.
Yes, if you have to leave. yeah, boy. Ultimately, got done with boy.
I can imagine, Steve. That is crazy. Yeah, very crazy. Simon, I cannot hear your conversations. Why can't you not hear me? Am I coming in? Can you hear me now?
She was talking about when someone's talking from in the room, not about you.
Okay. Steve, you
Yeah.
may have to come up here closer, my friend. You know, I thought you're, yeah, I guess not. So if you can do me a favor, Steve. Yeah, please. At least it'll help me with the people on Zoom. Thank you.
No one's ever accused me of talking softly. I know.
All right. All right, so let's see a couple of the questions we have here. So filling in the dark, not able to hear anybody, just you, Simon. Ah, okay. Got it. All right. So one, please speak loud and proud if you have any thoughts. Steve, you know what you need to do. All right, let's go ahead and continue. Yes,
Assignment.
an assignment? Yes, sir. It is part of a condition. Absolutely.
Assignment is not contingency.
But it's a condition, but it's not a contingency. It's not. Well, and remember, an assignment is it does have 17 days. All right. And an assignment can be where I assign it to my own trust, I assign it to my own LLC or corporation. Okay. An assignment is not, I'm going to assign it to another entity that is not my entity. That you need to have written approval from the seller. Okay. And if the seller is okay to assign it to someone else, then it needs to be in writing. But also part of that condition is that it's 17 days. After 17 days, you cannot ask for that assignment anymore. This is why you create the contingency removal, the CR form, to eliminate all of these conditions. So that way, if the buyer's continuing forward, then, you know, we know that the buyer is, you know, willing and able to continue in closing the deal. Okay. Standard time frames, 17 days inspection, appraisal 17, and loans. Okay, pretty self-explanatory, right? Part of the process is, and it can also be staggered, right? Sometimes you'll see 17 days for the loan, but inspections you'll see 10 days. That's perfectly fine as long as the buyer knows they have 10 days from the time of acceptance to do any and all inspections. Also appraisal, you know, I've seen where 17 days is not the standard, but 10 days or 12 days. As long as you and the lender know that they need to proactively push the appraisal to get done within the time frame. And if you don't, then what do you need to do? You need to do an extension of time addendum, right? Otherwise, what happens if you don't release a contingency? The seller has the right to send you a notice to perform. Okay, and that notice to perform is what? 2 days, 48 hours. All right, I believe part of the presentation goes into that. Any questions regarding contingency timelines? So active removal of contingencies process must be removed in writing, okay? It's not passive. It must be in writing because the buyer can argue is, yeah, I verbally said it and I meant it, but where's the proof, right? Where's the proof that I actually put it in writing? This is why documentation is important and vital, okay? failure, risk of cancellation, notice to buyer to perform. Buyer has 2 days act upon notice, right? So if I get a notice to perform today, is today considered one of the 2 days? No, today is considered 0 days. Okay. So anytime today will be 0 days of that 2-day period to release that as a condition or cancel. Meaning that tomorrow would be 1 as an example, and then 2 would be, as an example, Sunday, right? But remember, if a contingency falls on a weekend or holiday, it reverts to the next calendar day or business day. Yeah, okay? So that's how it works. So be on it. This is what I would do all the time too, is if I have an escrow, it doesn't matter if I represent the buyer and the seller, what I would do is on my calendar, I would check and make sure that, okay, the contingencies are supposed to, and your TC should know also as well. Your TC will give you the timelines of events of what certain contingencies need to be removed. Okay, so it's important to follow the rules. Otherwise, you're going to get slapped with a notice to perform, and it can be stressful, right? Now, communications is everything as well. Navigating cancellations, buyers initialed. Contingency must be in good faith, right? And within their right to exercise, right? The buyer held out to their contingencies, right? And decides, look, after doing all these inspections, I just don't feel comfortable with all of the issues this home has. The buyer has the right to cancel because of that. Now it's our job, right, is to be able to say, look, all properties are sold in as is. You're going to have some issues with the home, especially if a home is, you know, 10, 20, 30 years, you're going to come across some issues. Even new construction, I've seen issues with new construction. Okay.
Simon, for the cancellations, can you just, because I'm new here, can you tell us how?
You're not that new.
Okay,
Stop
I
it.
mean, for this part. So how does it actually happen? Like, is there a form that should be sent, whether it's buyer or seller? How does it happen? Just
Yeah, so in order for the cancellation, depending on who you represent, right? Because both either the buyer can send the cancellation. So if the buyer is canceling, there has to be a reason behind the cancellation. If you look at the CC form, there's conditions there. What's the condition? Usually one of them says, the buyer is exercising the right per paragraph, whatever, right? 14B as an example. That's the reason they're canceling based on a provision on the purchase agreement. And that
sorry
could
to
be
interrupt, but my question was, how do you inform, how do you notify the other party of the cancellation? How should it be done?
well, there's a couple ways. You either pick up the phone and call the listing agent and say, hey, by the way, it looks like we're going to be canceling, or email, right? Email, text message and say, look, we're going to, unfortunately, the buyer decided to cancel. We're sending you the cancellation of contract or cancellation of escrow. So you're going to put it in writing. You're going to send an email. You're going to call the listing agent and let them know that the buyer has decided to go in a different direction. You had something to say, Steve, or?
Well, I mean, it needs to go in writing under the cancellation of contract.
Correct.
CC.
Right.
Within the Form CC, it talks about who's the initiating party canceling, and it also then has a place for dealing with the deposit. So here is where you'll find out if your buyer is on the same page as when the contract was written. Cancellation of, sometimes buyers will still say, why don't I deposit back?" Even though they're canceling and they may even be out of their window because they signed off on their contingencies.
Got it. Steve, for some reason, they keep saying we cannot hear you. So I don't know what's going on. Yeah. Is it echoey? Is that what you're hearing, or you don't hear anything?
It's very distant.
Well, he is a little distant. Yeah, I apologize. So, you want to repeat the question or at least kind of give us a general rule? Let me move closer.
When canceling, the cancellation contract needs to be signed. Typically, and so it's the buyer canceling. There are two spots on the cancellation contract. One, canceling and why, and whatever provision that they are then using. And then dealing with the deposit, the good faith earnest money. Who gets the earnest money in escrow?
Right.
And it's at that point, even if the buyer is canceling, after having signed off all their contingencies, based, meaning that typically speaking, they would be forfeiting the deposit to the seller. Sometimes the buyer will say, well, I think I'm entitled to my deposit back. It's at this point, you'll find out whether or not you're canceling, now you may have an additional headache. The buyer is going to fight. The seller's probably going to say, hey, for the contract, based on the time frame, canceling, I'm entitled to that. So you'll know at that moment.
Right. Did you hear that? A little better?
No, unfortunately.
No, not at all. But I think it's a good idea to give him the microphone or something, or
Well,
anybody
there is
that's
no
talking.
microphone. The problem is it's on my laptop, so what I'll do, no, what I'll need to do is I'll probably connect. Yeah, I'll probably connect the mic. And then that way, if you have a question or you want to address it, then I'll give you the mic. So thank you. At least we know, because here, I mean, I can hear you perfectly fine, but I completely understand for the people on Zoom, it may come out a little echoey, so I apologize, but next week, I'll make sure to mic up the audience too as well. So thank you. All right, let's continue just for the sake of time. So deposit implication. Earnest money deposit typically is 3%. That 3% is held in escrow. Risk, post contingencies, cancellation can lead to forfeit, right? So remember, that earnest deposit is secured, right? It's secured by a third neutral party, which is escrow, right? The buyer in good faith submits an offer in good faith. They put an earnest deposit, and in good faith, that money is security, right, towards the buyer's obligation, right? That goes to down payment, closing costs, but eventually that goes towards the seller's proceeds as well, right? I submitted offer at this, I'm selling the property at this. Ultimately, we do 30 days, close, seller gets the proceeds, the buyer gets a home, the buyer has a new mortgage payment, right? In essence, 3% is the standard, right? Of what the contract says. Now, not all listing agents and buyers do put 3%. They'll start off very low with the hopes that they get their offer accepted with those conditions, right? Maybe they're just putting 2%. And if the seller is okay with it, then we open escrow, and escrow is instructed that the buyer will come in with the 2%, right? Now, a savvy listing agent will look at all the financials, right? Look at the bank statements and see if they have what they're saying. If they're putting 20% or 10% or 5%, remember, there's also closing costs. Do they have the means to do so? Plus, the deposit, right? Now you can navigate and say, look, they're putting 2% or 1% earnest deposit, but in essence, they have the money to do so. Let's put it on the counter offer that we're going to go 3%. Okay. And then that's where you push the buyer to put in additional means to escrow. Okay. Now, if the buyer forfeits the earnest deposit, Does that mean that the whole entire 3% is released to the buyer? Anyone? Yeah.
Has to be
If the
reasonable.
buyer, if the buyer, excuse me, if the buyer releases or forfeits the 3%, does that mean that the entire 3% go to the seller?
It has to be reasonable.
It has to be reasonable. Okay, tell me more. What does that mean? What is reasonable? Anyone else? Good point. The contract is very clear and concise of what it says, right? It says up to 3%. In my opinion, I think that, the seller can ask for the entire 3%, but the buyer can also challenge that and says, well, it says up to 3%. Show me what damages I've incurred for you. Right? And that could be the argument, because escrow is not going to just release the money to the seller because the buyer failed, right? And ultimately released all contingencies, right? The buyer breached the contract doesn't automatically mean that the seller is going to be entitled to the deposit immediately, right? It all really depends on the situation and the scenario. But if I'm a buyer and I'm a savvy buyer, and I put, because I'm aggressive and I want my offer to be accepted, yeah, I'll put 3%. I might even put 4%, right? If I fail, I'm going to argue my point across and say, look, I know I failed and I released any and all contingencies, but tell me what damages did I incur, or what damages did you incur? And then I'll start the negotiations there. If the earnest deposit of 3%, let's just say as an example, is $30,000, I'll say, look, yeah, I'm canceling, but I'm going to throw $15,000 in good faith to cancel this and see where it goes. Now, does the seller have to agree to that? No, right? Nuh-uh. I've been damaged. I want the entire 3%. That's always the typical question the seller wants. I want the whole $30,000, right? Now, remember, if there's not a meeting of the mind and the buyer doesn't release it, then the money stays in escrow until we come to an agreement. That may be escalated to a a mediation. Okay. And I've gone on many mediations that it's not always straight shot. It looks great on black and white, and it feels that we have a compelling position. But trust me, I've seen in my personal experience, mediations go left field and go right field, never the way it's supposed to. Just saying. I'll give you an example. Happened to one of our agents here a couple of years back. They represented the seller. The buyer released any and all contingencies, loan, appraisal, physical conditions, everything. And we had a contingency removal CR form. The buyer at the last minute decided to cancel. I don't remember the reason, but the buyer decided to cancel. They even signed a cancellation of escrow, releasing the money to the seller. It was signed and executed. So not just that we had the contingency removal of all, we had a cancellation of escrow, releasing the money to the seller. And that was given to escrow. But you know that escrow is just not going to immediately release it. They want an amendment confirming. Within 24 hours, the buyer decided, no, I changed my mind. That was not what I wanted to do. Yeah. And you're thinking, well, gosh, we have a contingency of all release. We have a cancellation of escrow, releasing the money to the seller. But escrow, being escrow, didn't want to be in the chaos. So they says, until you guys decide what you want to do, the money stays in escrow. and the money ended up staying in escrow for a month and a half. And guess what? The buyer was able to get 50% of the money back. Because you would think so. I don't know. They didn't want to go through the headache. And they thought that, you know, by leaving the money in escrow, and the buyer had no intentions of giving up the money. And no intentions of doing mediation, apparently. They were just going to sit. And it's not like they needed the money immediately because the buyer had deep pockets. So they could have ride it as long as they wanted to. But ultimately, they came to an agreement, says, look, I'm just going to just shoot it out there and see if this changes. And the buyer says, look, I want to cancel, but we're not going to release the entire. I'm willing to give you 50% of the money. And the seller says, you know what? We've been in this open escrow for a month and a half. I'll take it. And they sign off on it. 50% went to the seller. 50% went back to the buyer. How about that? Okay. Now, you're absolutely correct. The first thing they should have done was go to mediation, because a mediator would put some sense into them, saying, look, you released, but they're going to do the same thing. They're going to go in one room and try to stir up things. Then they're going to go to another room, stir up things, to ultimately come to some type of agreement, because it's all about the agreement, ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to earnest deposit. Just because it shows this and it looks perfect doesn't mean it's going to go that way. And I've experienced that firsthand. Okay, so don't stress so much. I'm in the middle. I screwed this all up and now it's all my fault. Yeah, it may be your fault. But escrow is not just going to immediately release the money. Now, if you put some wazoo type of agreement that says immediately, then that changes the trajectory of this conversation. So, you know, try to stick to the agreement and not modify it. Don't do anything in addition, because now that interprets something totally different as instructions between the buyer and the seller, right? Be careful with that. So the 3% that was supposed to go to the seller didn't go to the seller after all. That's what's so unique about real estate transactions. It's just weird that way.
Hey, Simon, I got a question.
Yes, and then I'll answer yours. Yes, sir.
Would that change the situation if the liquidated damages clause was signed by both parties and the buyer decided to cancel after removing contingencies?
The thing it was that they did sign the liquidated damage provision. It was signed and initialed by both parties.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was signed. But remember, escrow is a neutral party, right? And the last thing they want to get involved is in a lawsuit because they released the money. Well, the contract says that the money's supposed to go to the seller, and I get it, yeah. But there's also language, and correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but there's language that says that must be mutually agreed, regardless if it goes to the seller, it goes to the buyer. They have to mutually agree to those terms, not just because what it says on the contract. Does that make sense? So, yeah. No? Okay.
Yeah, I believe, Simon, that the
Hold on, Steve's saying something.
oh, go ahead, go ahead.
Under your scenario, based on the cancellation of our agent in the office a couple years ago.
Yeah.
That the cancellation was fully signed off, even agreed to on the cancellation to release the 3% deposit to the seller. And liquidated damages clause was initialed in the contract. But then prior to the signing of the actual cancellation instructions,
Right.
releasing the monies, that's when the buyer had a change of heart and said, I want to fight for some of the money back. But what most likely took place, and correct me if I'm wrong, it went to mediation, not arbitration, where it was a calculated decision based on the seller to put an end to it and say, and they then said, I will agree to release 50% or give back versus taking on the fight per the contract.
Right.
Okay, because who knows how long it'll take to enforce for the enforcement. But based on the contract of liquidated damages clause, okay, typically a seller, if it was all by the fault of the buyer and no fault of the seller, that buyer would have to, per the contract of liquidated damages, okay, be required to forfeit the full amount up to the 3% to the seller as the damages. Because understanding, now, what our jobs though as agents, what we have to be careful of is be careful using the words guarantee. I guarantee you're going to get it. You need to use words such as per the contract, you are entitled. Okay. And yet when it comes to the enforcement and dealing with actions such as having to now go to arbitration, okay, first mediation. Now remember, mediation is not binding. Arbitration is binding. Okay, so it was a mutual decision between the buyer and the seller. It was a calculated decision by that seller to say, all right, fine, I'll give up the fight. I'll keep the half of it. I'll keep 15. Let me put my house back on the market in order for me to resell my home. Is most likely what had taken place.
Surprisingly, no, it didn't even go to mediation.
It went straight to
It
arbitration?
didn't go to mediation nor.
Oh, this
arbitration. This was just the buyer and the seller.
buyer just negotiated amongst themselves. All right, so it still was a calculated decision between, for that seller to say, fine, I'll take half and move on with, to get out of the dispute.
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
you know,
That was it.
all right, so, yeah, all right. I first thought it was a mediation that
Yeah,
had taken
And
place.
that's usually the right to exercise, right? The first component is try to mediate it, right? Try to get a neutral party that would hear both sides, look at all the contracts. And their job is to influence, to push them, to nudge them, to get them to come to an agreement. And whatever agreement that is, if it's releasing, not releasing, or giving some of the money to make this work, as long as everyone's on the same page and they're okay, then that's the whole purpose of mediation. Now, arbitration is a different animal. Okay, arbitration is where you now provide evidence. An arbitrator will hear the case and you're able to, give your presentation. You get to cross-examine the opposing party, and then you do your final thoughts. And then the arbitrator, within 20 to 48 hours, will have their decision. So it's kind of like going to court in front of a judge, having two attorneys, which is a different animal than just your typical mediation.
Well, and the main difference between mediation and arbitration, mediation is virtually sitting around the round table, the parties sitting around the round table. We have a dispute, can we work it out? And hopefully when they leave, there's an arrangement that both parties are happy with. But under mediation, one of the parties, or not both the parties, have the right to change their mind. Okay, they can say, it sounded good, but more after I got home, thought about it, I don't like it. They can now agree to say, I no longer agree. So typically the next step then, because now you're back into dispute again, okay, is if you, per the contract, when there is a dispute, first step, even before it goes to arbitration, is to go to mediation. And if it's not resolved through mediation, then it goes to arbitration, which then an arbitrator, okay, or arbitrator panel, they then make the final decision. And once that gavel is then banged down, that's the final. There is no more discussion. And that is the final answer.
Right. Thank you, Steve.
Mhm.
Appreciate it. Good stuff. All right, let's continue. I know we're a little past our time. All right, so best practice for managing timelines. It's obviously communications amongst the agent, having a checklist, communicate as often as possible, right? Because that can alter a dispute or disagreement. It's when agents stop communicating, right? That's when you see problems. Communicate with your clients, understand the contingencies, and respond properly, right? That's part of the process, right? We don't want to drag it because you're scared or nervous or you're overwhelmed, right? And I remember that happening to one of our agents. Agent just got overwhelmed and just shut down, literally shut down, and it was a foreclosure. And thank goodness I stepped in, had to go in there and I mean, it was intense, but we were able to delay the foreclosure process. But the agent just shut down. And when I finally got a hold, the agent was taking a nap and he says he was just overwhelmed. True story, folks. True story. So remember, all of these elements are very important. Communication, communication, communication. Scenario one, buyer misses inspection deadlines, right? If you do miss a deadline, there's a couple things you can do. You can extend that time to release that contingency by asking an extension of time addendum. Otherwise, you're going to get a notice to perform, NBP, right? You don't want that because then that's crunch time. If you don't perform within the 2-day provision, the seller has the right to exercise the cancellation. Buyers cancel within the loan contingency. It's a valid point, yeah. If the buyer still holds on to that loan contingency and the loan doesn't get approved after all, that's a way for the seller, excuse me, for the buyer to be able to cancel, okay, within that time period. That's why you have those protections in those layers. Okay, so a Q&A, let's skip on this. Conclusion, understand and manage contingencies and timelines. Proactive, smooth transaction. I think we kind of pointed out. I want you to get your phones and take a photo of this so you can have it. So these are some car resources. Navigate contingencies in the contract, quick guide contingency removals, and then sample timelines. Okay, so take both. Both are different, and it just gives you just an additional layer of training, so that way you're more on top of these conditions and timelines. All right, and that pretty much concludes. Any questions, thoughts, or concerns regarding today's topic? Anyone on chat? Let's see. Other than you can't hear Steve.
Did they hear the last thing when I stood up in the computer?
Well, yeah, I think they did.
Hey, Simon, I got a question.
Yes, sir.
This is Alon from the KW Luxury Office regarding assignment that's built in to the offer, and it's by default 17 days. I can never understand for the life of me why they decided, the California Associate Realtor Attorney decided to put that as a default, because 99% of contracts don't even involve assignments. So how would you recommend, as the listing agent, just countering it out altogether?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You got to be very clear and concise and right straight to the point. Because here's the problem that we're seeing a lot, okay? And I apologize that I'm going over my time, but I think it's a very important conversation. There's a lot of wholesalers, and a lot of these wholesalers, what they're doing is they're tying up the properties. And a lot of listing agents that don't have a good understanding in how to maneuver that, they can tie up the property and tie it up for a very long time. And then they threaten to against the seller because they're not performing. So you got to be very, very tight on what those conditions are. And you can put language that says, you know, just to reinforce that this property will not be wholesale. And I would put that in there without the seller's concession and approval. A lot of listing agents and agents in general don't know that it has to be approved by the seller. Yes, there's a language on the purchase agreement about assignment, but the assignment is only to its own entity, meaning if the buyer is submitting it as Simon Cazares, and then I decide within the 17 days that I want to send it to my trust or my LLC or my S Corp or C Corp, I can do that within that time period that I'm going to take it out of my personal and into a trust or corporation. That's perfectly fine, and there's nothing that the seller can do about it. It's after, right? After the 17 days and you release that, then you cannot continue. The issue that we have here is that a buyer will submit an offer and now go fish to find a end user wholesaler to find that will ultimately close it. These are sometimes called double escrows, or they'll get a spread, right? I secure it for this, but I wholesale it to this person who ultimately that second person is going to be closing, and I'm going to get a spread in between, right? Well, you got to be very careful because I've seen circumstances where you get hustled and bullied because they use, legal words, legal terms, and they threaten. Now you gotta, provide all of these new disclosures and material facts of all these inspections we've done because they're just trying to delay the process to find someone else that will ultimately close it. Now, this is why you want to have very tight conditions and parameters in place to protect the seller from these so-called wholesalers that their intention is never to buy, but the intention to profit from your demise and not understanding of how that works. Now, going back to my original question, is putting very tight conditions on the counter offer. So you're basically having walls and protection in case this does go sideways. Now you have loopholes that you can maneuver and say, well, that was not what we agreed upon. And because of that, we're going to now send you the notice to perform. And if you don't perform, then we have the seller has the right to cancel. And there's nothing that the buyer can do because they're saying, well, wait a minute, we have another buyer, and that buyer also has to be vetted by the seller, right? Because the new buyer is now taking responsibility. Remember, there's still a deposit in escrow. What happens to that deposit? And I've seen circumstances where that buyer, the original buyer, is now asking for that money to be released, and then the new buyer puts in the deposit back in. You got to be very careful. And if you don't know how to maneuver those, please bring it to my attention, and we'll definitely help you navigate that because it can go sideways really, really, really quick. Okay. So
Thank you, Simon, for that. A lot of people, a lot of listing agents may or may not be aware of item K on the RPA assignment request. It gets overlooked. A lot of the times, when I write buyer's offers, 99% of the time, the listing agent does not even counter that. So, and we have no intention as the buyer's agent to even have an assignment in there. It's just by default. So, a lot of people just miss it altogether, and I would encourage, especially listing agents, to be aware of that.
100%, absolutely. Good point there. So, all right, well, that concludes. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you. Have a wonderful Mother's Day weekend, and I'll see you in the next contract class. Thanks, everyone.